This week's lecture covers Chapter 2 on energy and matter. By the end of this chapter, hopefully you will understand what systems are and how feedback loops affect them, explain the first and second laws of thermodynamics, understand why we can't throw things away, why all things cycle throughout the systems, and explain the processes of photosynthesis and respiration, know what qualities make water so unique and essential for life as we know it, know why big fierce animals are rare, and be able to explain how and why elements such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphate, and sulfur cycle through the ecosystems. So as we get started with this chapter, we're covering a lot of different systems, and the main system that we'll talk about in environmental science is an ecosystem. First, to just define the word system, it's a network of interdependent components and processes with materials and energy flowing from one component of the system to another. I think the best way to explain what this means is through an ecosystem or an example of a living system, and that's just looking at all of the plants and animals in their environment and how the materials such as nutrients, water, and energy move from one animal to another. So on the next slide, we'll cover an example of looking at the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So systems can be described in general terms, and a simple system consists of different variables, also called compartments. And in this example, the variables are just the plants and animals in the ecosystem that we're looking at. So for example, the rabbit, the fox, and the plant here. The flows are the pathways by which the resources move from one variable to the next. So in this ecosystem here, we're looking at the flow of energy and nutrients from the plant into the rabbit, because the rabbit eats the plant, and the flow of that energy from the rabbit into the fox as the fox eats the rabbit. And then the energy from nutrients essentially get broken down by decomposers, and those nutrients can then go back into the plant. So again, these animals and plants are the variables, and the flows show either energy or nutrients moving from one variable or organism to another. There's two different types of systems, open systems and closed systems, although in reality, in studying environmental science, we are really only looking at open systems. And an open system are systems that receive inputs from their surroundings and produce outputs that leave the system. A closed system exchanges no energy or matter with its surroundings. And if you look at a system, so for example, this picture on the right, we have sunlight coming into the plant, helping the plant to grow, animals that are eating this plant to get their energy, animals eating other energy, water flowing in to give the plants and animals the water they need. And all of these all of these organisms and the energy in them can leave whatever the system is that you're looking at. So for example, if you're looking at a certain area in a forest, animals leave, water flows down a river out of the system, water evaporates into the atmosphere. The sunlight comes from the sun, and that heat energy is dissipated into the atmosphere. And so all the things are moving from one organism to another, and that's why we call it an open system. So except for the bottom here says, except for the universe, in which everything that exists in the universe stays in the universe, all other systems are open. An exchange of energy and matter occurs with other systems. Throughput is a term that we use to describe energy and matter that flow into, through, and out of a system. In an ecosystem, we talk about positive and negative feedback loops. And in a positive feedback loop, there is some positive feedback, or whatever you're looking at is increasing in the ecosystem. So for example, when an animal reproduces, this is called positive feedback because that thing that you're looking at has increased in the ecosystem. A negative feedback loop makes something within the ecosystem smaller. So for example, an animal eating a plant that's a negative feedback for that plant because the plant is decreasing. And the two different feedback loops work together to stabilize each other. So if there were an unlimited number of plants, then the rabbits could continue eating these plants and reproducing forever, and you would have an infinite number of rabbits. In reality, though, eventually when you get a certain number of rabbits, there are not going to be enough plants to go around, and rabbits will start dying off or moving out of the area in search of new food. And so the number of plants regulates the number of rabbits. And so this interaction between the positive and the feedback loop helps ensure that you have overall a stable ecosystem. The term emergent properties is used when the characteristic of a whole system are greater than the sum of its parts. The picture here shows a mangrove forest. Mangroves grow in tropical coastlines throughout the world, and we can consider mangrove forests an example of emergent properties. Because their direct economic value can be modest, thousands of kilometers of mangrove-lined coasts have been cleared to make room for shrimp ponds or beach resorts. But the mangrove forests provide countless indirect economic values. Prop roots trap sediment and stabilize mudflats, improving water clarity and protecting offshore coral reefs from silt. Mangroves also protect small fish and other marine species. Many commercial ocean fish and shrimp species spend juvenile stages hiding among the mangrove roots, and the forest protects the shoreline from damaging storms and tsunamis. Collectively, these services can be worth hundreds of times the value of a shrimp farm, but they exist only when the many parts of the system function together. If we look at an ecosystem, all of the things within an ecosystem are made up of something called matter. And matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Matter can be either a solid, a liquid, or a gas, depending on the arrangement of molecules. So usually gas molecules are moving quicker and far apart. Liquid molecules tend to be moving a little bit slower and are a little closer together. And typically a solid, the molecules are very close together, and so the object feels hard. The principle of conservation of matter states that matter is neither created nor destroyed, but rather is recycled over and over again. And that's an important concept in our ecosystem because all of the elements within that ecosystem, they don't just disappear. The energy and the matter, say, in a plant might go into be eaten by a rabbit, and the matter from that rabbit might die and be decomposed and go to the ground, or the rabbit might be eaten by a fox and the matter go into that fox. So all of the matter that we look at goes somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. Let's go a little further now into what exactly matter is. So matter is made up of elements, and elements are things such as phosphorus is an example of an element, nitrogen is an example of an element, and these are substances that cannot be broken down into any smaller or simpler forms by ordinary chemical reactions. An atom is just the smallest particle that exhibits the characteristics of an element. So for example, a phosphorus atom is 1 unit of phosphorus. A nitrogen atom is 1 unit of nitrogen. And if you look at an atom, all atoms have the same parts within them. So whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen, all atoms have a center area called a nucleus, which has positively charged protons and neutral neutrons. And then that nucleus is surrounded by one or more electrons, which are negatively charged particles. Here is a picture of the periodic table of elements, and this table has information about all the different elements that we know about, and tells how many, from this table you can tell how many protons, how many neutrons are in the elements, and all different characteristics about the elements. If you take chemistry, you will learn a lot more about how to interpret lots of different information from this table. Just to briefly cover here what the periodic table tells us and how the structure of different atoms. If we look at the periodic table, we see boxes like this one here, and this is a box with the letter C inside of it, and this is a box that tells us all about the element carbon. So the symbol here is usually an abbreviation for the element, so they use C to abbreviate carbon. This down here tells us the name of the element. Up here is the atomic number of the element. And down here is the atomic weight of the element. So the atomic number tells us the number of protons. The atomic weight tells us usually the number of protons plus neutrons, because they give each proton and neutron a weight of about 1 unit. So by taking the atomic weight and subtracting the atomic number, which is the number of protons, we can get the number of neutrons. And then there are usually the same number of electrons in an atom as there are protons in a standard atom. So if we have 6 protons, we would also have 6 electrons. So again, what I would focus on remembering for an atom is that atoms have positive protons, neutral neutrons in the center or nucleus, and electrons that move around the outside of this nucleus. So in the last example, we looked at carbon having 6 electrons, which are negatively charged, and 6 protons, which are positively charged. So if you can do some basic algebra and you have that essentially 6 positive of something and 6 negative of something, they cancel each other out to create an atom with no charge. But a lot of atoms, such as, for example, sodium here and chlorine here, are willing to give up or accept electrons, which actually makes them more stable, but then gives them a positive or negative charge. And here we have, in the picture down here, we have sodium and chlorine, which react and bond together to make a molecule called sodium chloride, which is just the chemical name for table salt. And sodium, in its outer ring here, its outer electron ring, and these circles here are just rings of electrons, and elements like to have a full outer ring. And if you want to learn a lot more about this, you can take chemistry, but just to cover the basics, sodium has 1 electron, this yellow dot here, that's in its outer ring. Chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer ring, and a full outer ring would be, for these rings out here, would be 8 electrons. And so chlorine would love to have 1 extra electron to fill up its outer ring, and sodium is happy to give away this 1 electron on the outer ring. And then this here becomes the outer ring, and it is full with 8 electrons. And then once sodium gives up its electron, it actually becomes positively charged because it has more protons than it does electrons. Chlorine, accepting this 1 extra electron or 1 extra negative charge, then has a charge of -1. Then these elements react essentially like magnets. You have a positively charged particle and a negatively charged particle, and they are attracted to each other, forming this clump or molecule called sodium chloride or table salt. And they don't readily come apart because once they react together and share these elements, they are happy the way they are and they stick together. We call a positively charged particle here a cation, and we call any particle with a negative charge an anion. And an ion is just something that has either a positive or a negative charge. As I just mentioned, certain elements like to join together with other elements to help them become more stable, and sometimes elements join together 2 of the same element. So for example, hydrogens, when you have just hydrogen gas, they join together in groups of 2. So 2 hydrogens will bond together. And that would be known as a hydrogen molecule. And other different types of elements can also join together. So for example, in water, we have hydrogen and oxygen joining together to form water. And one group of these 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen is known as a water molecule. If the molecule is composed of 2 different types of elements, it is considered a compound. So all of these here are examples of molecules because they are made up of 1 or more in number of elements. And only some of these are the ones in rows 2 and 3 are compounds, which are made of 2 different types of elements. Throughout this course, we'll talk about acids and bases. So I'd like to cover here briefly what exactly an acid and a base, what those terms mean. So substances that are willing to give up a hydrogen ion, so that have a hydrogen ion and will give it up in water, are known as an acid. And usually what we think of as an acid is we think of acids as having a pH below 7. And oftentimes acids, some characteristics of acids are that, one, they have the pH below 7. They usually will have a sour taste. You don't normally want to taste things to see if they're acids, because acids, another characteristic is they can burn. So those are some characteristics of acids. Bases are substances that readily bond with a hydrogen ion, so they'll take a hydrogen ion, or they often release a hydroxide or oxygen hydrogen OH ion. And bases are things that have a pH of above 7, so from 7 to 14, and they oftentimes feel slippery, like if you feel bleach and it has that very slippery feel, and they tend to taste bitter. And something that has a pH of exactly 7 is termed neutral. The pH scale is a scale of numbers ranging from 0 to 14 that tells us how acidic or basic something is. And on this scale, 0 to 7 is an acid, 7 is neutral, so if you had absolutely pure water, it would be a pH of 7. And then from 7 to 14, we have the bases. Some examples over here on the right, we have battery acid at a very, very low pH, so very acidic, going up to hydrochloric acid, and then at pH of 2, we have things like lemon juice and stomach acids and vinegar. A little bit less acidic are grapefruit and orange juice, but if you hear about juices being bad for your teeth because they're acidic, this is the reason why, because they are pretty acidic. Tomato juice is a pH of 4. Coffee, pH of 5. Rainwater is actually somewhat acidic. It has a pH of about 5. Milk has a pH of about 6. And then on the basic side, we have a little bit basic as seawater, a little more basic as baking soda, going up to like a pH of 11. Much more basic is ammonia. And soapy water would be a pH of about 12. Bleach is pH of 13, and very, very basic would be something like liquid drain cleaner at a pH of close to 14. As you go up a number on the pH scale, it's a logarithmic scale, which means that going from a pH of 7 to a pH of 6 means that that thing became, the pH is actually 10 times more acidic. And then going up from a 6 to a pH of 7, or down actually from pH 6 to pH 7, so getting more acidic. A pH of something that's pH 5 is 10 times more acidic than something with a pH of 6, and something with a pH of 5 is 100 times more acidic than something with a pH of 7. So as you go up or down in this scale, although the number may just go from a 5 to a 6 or a 4 to a 6, it's actually becoming much, much more acidic or basic as you go up and down on the pH scale. Here we have a list of organic compounds, and remember, a compound is just a group of elements that have 2 or more different types of elements in the group. And the term organic, despite how we use it in our day-to-day lives, actually means living. So it's organic compounds are the compounds that are in living things. And organic compounds all have a carbon backbone. So if we look at the structure of a fat or a lipid, they have carbon in a straight line down the center. Carbohydrates are another type of organic compound. They have carbons that go in a ring. And then proteins, another type of organic compound, have a line of carbons with 2 different groups attached to them. And nucleic acids, which are things like DNA, we'll cover that a little bit later what that is, has a sugar group or a ring of carbons and then 2 other groups attached to it. So as I've just stated, there are 4 major categories of organic compounds, or compounds that are in living things, and these are fats, or lipids, sugars or carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. To cover in a little bit more detail the 4 categories of organic molecules, or the molecules in living things, we have lipids, which are things like fats and oils. And the purpose of fats and oils in living things is to store energy for the cells and to provide the core of the cell membrane, or to make up that cell membrane and other structures within the cell. Carbohydrates are things like sugars and starches. They also are an energy source for living things, and they provide structure to the cells. So they usually consist of long chains of simple sugars like glucose. The last 2 types of organic molecules are proteins and nucleotides. And proteins are made up of chains of what we call amino acids. And when these amino acids get together in a certain arrangement, we get different proteins. And proteins do things within our cells, such as enzymes, which speed up chemical reactions, and proteins are used to make up all of our muscles are made of proteins. Nucleotides are very complex molecules, and these are things like DNA and RNA, and we'll get into their structure here in a little bit, but DNA and RNA store and express genetic information. Essentially, it's the instructions telling your body how to do everything that it needs to do. If you take biology, you'll learn a lot more about DNA and all the parts of DNA and how DNA works and what all these parts do. But just for this course, to briefly explain DNA to you, DNA is a long structure. They call it a double helix because it is composed of 2 strands, and they are spiraled around each other. On these strands, we have these letters here, and we call those bases. And they are types of nucleotides. And essentially, these bases are sort of like a code. And when you put these different, there's only 4 different bases, G, A, T, and C, or guanine, adenine, thymine, and cytosine. And when you put these bases together in a different order, it's a code within your cell telling your cell to produce a certain protein. And then these proteins, when put together, are instructions for lots of other different things within your body. So you could, as you can imagine, you could take these letters here, you could arrange them in countless different possibilities, and essentially when you get these long strands, you get all the genes within your body, and essentially all, as I said, all the instructions telling your body what to do. About elements of being the smallest units of matter that exist. And in a living thing, those elements are organized into structures that we call cells. And cells are either round or square shaped, sort of like sacs that contain lots of different parts that help an organism to survive. And cells are assembled for example, in a plant here, we have all these cells within the plant leaf here, and these cells are all arranged next to each other, and they help the plant perform all the functions that it needs to do: transport nutrients, get energy. And we talked about emergent properties earlier. Cells exhibit emergent properties. So one cell on its own has a certain role, but when you put all of those cells together, the role of all those cells working together can make the whole entire plant function, whereas one cell on its own really can't do all that much. So the whole plant can do much more than any one cell alone. We've covered how carbon is essential in a lot of living organisms. Next, we're going to cover nitrogen and phosphorus, as these are also key nutrients to living organisms. And nitrogen and phosphorus are also essential parts of proteins and nucleic acids in cells. And you derive these elements by consuming food molecules, but plants have to extract these elements from the environment. If there's low levels of nitrogen or phosphorus in the environment, it can often limit growth of plants and ecosystems. If there's an abundance of nitrogen and phosphorus, then it can cause runaway growth, such as algal blooms in a pond. Next here, we're going to move on to energy. And so we've covered all the elements, which would be the chemistry. We've covered the DNA, which would be your biology. And now moving on to energy, this is sort of your introduction to physics for the course. Energy is the ability to do work, such as moving any type of matter over a distance or heat transferring from one thing to another. Energy can take many different forms. So you can have heat energy, light energy, electricity, chemical energy. One example of energy is kinetic energy, and this is energy contained in moving objects. So as objects move, we call that kinetic energy. So examples are a rock rolling down a hill, or for example, in this picture here, the water that flows over the dam. As it moves, you get energy flowing through that water. And that's, for example, why we can put like a turbine on a dam and collect energy from water moving over a dam. We call the water sitting at the top of the dam we consider that as having potential energy, which means that when it falls over the dam, this energy will be released. And so even though the water at the top is still, we consider it as having a source of potential energy. And that's just stored energy, potential energy, stored energy that is available for use, like a rock sitting at the top of a hill or water stored behind a dam. There is also chemical energy is a potential energy, and it's stored in the food that you eat. So when you eat that food, it gets broken down and gives your body energy. Here's some basics on energy. Heat describes the energy that can be transferred between objects of different temperatures. So for example, if you were to stand by a fire and you were very, very cold, the fire could help warm you up. That heat energy is transferred from the fire into your body. Also, a lot of it's released out into the air. The study of thermodynamics deals with how energy is transferred naturally, and there's a couple different laws of thermodynamics that your book covers. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy is conserved. And what that means is that the energy doesn't just disappear. So when a fire burns out, the energy didn't just, that heat energy didn't just go away. Some of that heat energy got transferred in our scenario to you as you got warmed up. Some of the heat energy gets transferred into the atmosphere and would make the surrounding areas warmer, such as if you had a fire in your house, it would make your house warm. So that energy goes somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. And the second law of thermodynamics states that with each successive energy transfer or transformation, there's less energy available to do work. So as the energy gets transferred from one object to another, some of that energy tends to go out into the environment. And there's less and less energy available as you move from one system to the next. So it didn't go away, it just, some of that energy dissipates out into the environment. And what this is saying is that there's disorder or entropy that tends to increase in all natural systems. And entropy just means that things get more and more disorderly naturally over time. And although it's not a physics example, if you think of your house, it's naturally going to, unfortunately, get messier or messier and messier as time goes by until you work to clean it up. So your house naturally will get more disorderly rather than keeping its current state as more and more things go on within your house. And the same thing within any physical process, things get more disorderly as the process goes on. Nearly all of the life on Earth gets its energy from the sun. It's the original source of energy. Sunlight travels to the Earth, and then plants and some types of bacteria can capture that energy from the sun through a process called photosynthesis and create sugar to use for energy. Other living things then eat the plants and use the sugar made by the plants for their own energy. This was the only way we knew that organisms could get energy until a discovery in 1977. So next up, you're going to see a video of what they discovered in 1977 in terms of a different way to get energy.
77. The discovery of hydrothermal vents releasing hot, mineral-rich water at the bottom of the ocean changed our understanding of the world as we know it. We had thought all life depended on sunlight to survive, but these vents showed us we have so much more to learn. Today, hydrothermal vents of all kinds continue to be found in areas of known volcanic activity across the ocean.
There it is. Oh my
The phenomenon continues to mesmerize scientists and ocean enthusiasts alike.
That's amazing. You get to do this sort of thing once in a lifetime.
Okay.
Once in a lifetime.
It's just brilliant. Brilliant.
The first discovery of hydrothermal vents in 1977 was actually on 35mm film. Geologist and oceanographer Dr. Bob Ballard was part of the research expedition that made history. Reports of dramatic spikes in water temperatures from a small area of the Galapagos Rift led Ballard and his crew to send a still camera down to investigate the area. Stunned by the unexpected findings captured in the photos, they deployed the Alvin submersible the very next day to explore the region firsthand. To their surprise, they had discovered an entirely new ecosystem, thriving with giant tube worms over a foot long, as well as many other life forms. Up to that point, all life was considered dependent on sunlight for photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert energy into a usable form of sugar. But this life was at depths far beyond the reach of sunlight. The discovery rocked the scientific community, prompting biologists to return to the site to investigate how these life forms were able to survive. They realized that the organisms were clustered around structures emitting plumes of superheated water packed with chemicals. Though toxic to humans, the chemicals provided nutrients that bacteria could convert to energy, much like plants convert sunlight during photosynthesis. This process of converting chemicals to energy became known as chemosynthesis and redefined science as we know it. The structures came to be known as hydrothermal vents for the superheated water they emit. Hydro, meaning water, thermal, referring to temperature, and vent, indicating the release of matter. Along volcanically active areas such as the mid-ocean ridge, water seeps into the Earth's crust through cracks and fissures and becomes superheated by hot magma within the Earth's layers. As it boils up to be released on the ocean floor, the water picks up dissolved metals and minerals along its journey. And finally, the water exits the Earth's oceanic crust, creating vent structures. The characteristics of hydrothermal vents vary depending on the specific metals and minerals in the water they emit. Vents known as black smokers emit water that appears as a thick black cloud because it is rich with sulfur-bearing minerals. As the dissolved minerals and metals encounter the freezing ocean water, they solidify in layers, forming massive structures called chimneys. Lasers, spaced at about 10 centimeters apart, almost 4 inches, help scientists determine chimney size. Some chimneys have been spotted at heights of up to 18 stories tall. In contrast, white smokers are characterized by the barium, calcium, and silicon they contain. Some vent fluids aren't characterized by a specific color, but can be identified by the shimmering water they emit due to the stark difference of water temperatures. And other vents simply emit carbon dioxide in streams of bubbles like carbonated soft drinks. Don't be fooled by what may seem like gently flowing water. The water pressure is so great down here that what appears to be a gentle outpouring of water would actually be a violent eruption if it were on the surface, much like geysers we see on land. The vent fluid can be up to 750 degrees Fahrenheit, 400 degrees Celsius, but it does not boil because of the immense pressure. It's amazing that life can thrive under these conditions, in the midst of scalding hot water, immense pressure, and near freezing ocean depths. The discovery of new geological and biological phenomena like this drives explorers every year to further investigate what else lies deep within the ocean.
As the video explained, this process of organisms getting energy from thermal vents is called chemosynthesis. And this is just a process where bacteria can extract energy from various chemical compounds, and then other organisms living around the vents can use the energy from those bacteria as their energy source. And this was a completely new way of getting energy. We assumed that everything came from energy from the sun, and this discovery in 1977 showed us that there are other ways to get energy, and who knows what other things are out there that we haven't even discovered yet, but those are the two ways that we know of at this point. Most all other organisms on Earth, other than the chemotrophs, the original energy source is from the sun, and the energy is captured by green plants. We often call these plants primary producers because they produce sugars or carbohydrates just from using sunlight, air, and water. Plants get their energy from sunlight, and as you can see down here, this diagram here at the bottom is what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, and it just shows at all these different wavelengths what type of light or radiation is emitted. Down from the very smallest of wavelengths where you have gamma rays, and then X-rays are a little bit larger wavelengths. Here we have the yellow curve here is the solar radiation, so you get anything from ultraviolet to visible light to infrared light from the sun. And then as you go to larger and larger waves, you get to microwaves and radio waves. And plants can use blue and red light to do their photosynthesis, where they convert this red and blue light into useful chemical energy that the plants can live to use, and then that other animals can use when they eat the plants. Let's take a look now at what exactly photosynthesis is and how photosynthesis can capture energy from the sun and make it something useful for plants. And this process may get a little bit confusing to you. Try to keep in mind the big picture here as you go through these next few slides. If you ever take biology, you'll go into this again and in even more detail. But the big picture is that using just sunlight, air, and water, plants can make sugar. And that's what photosynthesis is. It's taking in sunlight, air, and water and making sugar out of it. The sugar is energy then that other animals can later use, and we'll go into that in the next few slides. But going over how photosynthesis works, in step one here, plants have a special green compound called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll can absorb sunlight and convert it into chemical energy. So this chlorophyll essentially just absorbs that light coming from the sun, and then through a series of reactions, it gives off energy. Plants then take water. Here's the water that they absorb from the ground, and carbon dioxide or CO2 that they absorb from the air, and essentially use the elements in the carbon dioxide and the water, rearrange those elements using the energy from the sun, and because all chemical reactions need energy to occur, and they reorganize this carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they reorganize it into sugar and oxygen. So in the photosynthesis chemical reaction, plants take in carbon dioxide and water, and they create sugar and oxygen. So here we have carbon dioxide and water go in, sugar and oxygen are created. And then when animals eat the plants, they take in the sugar made by the plant and break it down to use it as energy. So if you all know, if you ate sugar, it would give your body a certain amount of energy. And that's from breaking down that sugar and releasing that energy stored in the sugar. Now we know that photosynthesis creates sugar, and the specific type of sugar that's created in photosynthesis is called glucose. And then, as I mentioned, plants and animals can use that glucose, and they also need oxygen, and they break down this glucose and oxygen to get energy for their own daily needs. Breaking down the sugar and using its energy is a process called respiration. And here's the formula for respiration. It's taking in sugar, oxygen, and breaking that down and giving off water and carbon dioxide, as well as released energy. And then animals use this energy to grow and carry out their daily cell needs. Respiration, if these things look familiar, is just photosynthesis back. So respiration, think of what your body takes in and what it gets rid of. So in a normal day, you're breathing in oxygen and you are breathing out carbon dioxide. And if you look at the respiration formula here, here's the oxygen that you breathe in, and then here's the carbon dioxide that you breathe out. You take in energy in sources such as sugar. Here's the sugar here. And then you release water when you urinate as a waste product. So taking in for yourself glucose and oxygen, and then giving off carbon dioxide and water as waste products. And that process or respiration creates energy because all of your cells need energy to survive. Let's just do a quick review here. So if you can't remember all of that, it is a lot to remember all the exact steps of what are going on, but at least remember the big picture that photosynthesis is using sunlight to create energy in the form of sugar. Respiration is the opposite. It's breaking down the sugar created by photosynthesis to get energy. So this diagram here shows how energy is transferred from the sun to plants to other animals and moved through an ecosystem. So let's just go through this diagram quickly here together. Energy from the sun comes down, hits the plants. Plants use that energy from the sun to do photosynthesis. Through photosynthesis, they create sugar, which is a high quality energy, and they give off oxygen. So they release oxygen into the air. That oxygen and sugar is then used by animals in a process called respiration. And in respiration, animals take in the sugar and oxygen released by the plants, and they break down the sugar and use that energy created by breaking down the sugar to do all of their daily functions. So all the functions that their cells need, that's where they get the energy from. Through respiration, the animals give off water in the form of their urine and other waste products, and they breathe out carbon dioxide. So our waste products as animals are carbon dioxide and water, whereas carbon dioxide and water are actually what plants need to take in to do photosynthesis. So plants take in what we give off as waste, and we take in essentially the sugar and oxygen that plants give off as somewhat a waste, although the plants can use the sugar too, but oxygen is sort of their waste that they breathe out. We've taken a brief look here at what's going on at a cellular level in terms of making and using energy within the cells in your body. Now we're going to go to a bigger look at what's going on in the world, and this is what ecologists study, which is looking at interactions between species, populations, and communities. We call this the ecosystem level. And species just means kind, and species refers to all organisms of the same kind. In biology, we would define as a species as two animals that can mate and create fertile offspring. Next, we're going to cover a few terms that ecologists use to describe organisms and their surroundings. And if you look at this diagram to the right, the very smallest group we have is an individual, and that's just one type of plant or animal of a certain species. A population consists of all the members of a species living in a given area at the same time. So here they have a little goldfish. The population would be that group of goldfish, or all animals of one species that are living in a certain area. All of the different populations, different living things living and interacting in a certain area make up what we call a community. So as you notice here, there's lots of different organisms here, different plants, different animals, but still all living things, and that is a community. Going a little bit bigger, we have the ecosystem, which is all of the living things that we had in the community, plus the physical environment, so the non-living things. So that would include the water that these animals live in, the rocks, the soil, so living and non-living things. This picture then further goes into biomes, which would be a large area, so a very large ecosystem, essentially looking at a much bigger area, such as you might have a forest biome or a desert biome. And then the biosphere would be even bigger, so it would be the whole large world that all these living things are living in, so even larger scale. Food chains allow us to look at the flow of energy through an ecosystem. For the most part, all energy in an ecosystem initially comes from the sun. The energy from the sun is captured by plants, and an organism that gets its energy from the sun is called a producer. Animals then eat the plants and each other to get energy. As animals eat plants, they obtain the energy they need to survive. In this way, energy is passed from the sun to plants and animals through an ecosystem. We can follow a sequence of organisms that feed on each other to create a food chain, or a sequence of organisms that feed on each other. Let's look at a food chain for the Klamath Falls area. One of the most common plants in Klamath County is big sagebrush. Many different animals eat the sagebrush, including jackrabbits. The sagebrush would be considered a producer, and a producer is an autotroph or a self-feeder, meaning that they feed themselves without having to go out and eat other food, using the energy from the sun. Any other animals that feed on the sagebrush would be considered or each other would be considered consumers. And consumers are heterotrophs, which simply means other feeder. And that means that they feed on other things. They can't obtain their own energy from the sun. Back to our food chain, we have our sagebrush, which is the producer. The jackrabbits that eat the sagebrush, again, are the primary consumers, or the first, primary meaning first animal to consume a plant, or the first link down in our food chain. Next, we have the bobcat, and the bobcat can eat the jackrabbit and get the energy from the jackrabbit. The bobcat is considered a secondary consumer because they're the second link down in the food chain. Then in turn, a wolf, we have our friend here, OR7, and the wolf could eat the bobcat. If the wolf ate the bobcat, he would be considered a tertiary consumer, or a third level consumer, because he's 1, 2, 3 levels down in our food chain. Now, the food chain that we showed is a possible sequence of events that could occur in the Klamath Falls area. But each of these animals in the food chain is usually capable of eating other food items as well, and each of them could also be eaten by other animals, which means there are a seemingly unlimited number of possible food chains. So to more accurately describe the flow of energy through an ecosystem, we construct a food web, which is a combination of food chains that are interconnected to create a network of feeding relationships. Just like the food chain, energy enters the food web at the level of producers, and then the energy flows through the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. Another term we use to describe where an animal is in a food chain is called the trophic level. And trophic level is an organism's feeding status in an ecosystem. So for example, whether it is a producer, a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer, etc. And that's just considered the trophic level. A couple other terms here that you'll come across when describing animals in an ecosystem are herbivores, who are consumers of plants, carnivores who eat meat, and omnivores who eat both plant and animal matter. The last group of organisms in our ecosystem that we need to consider are the recyclers, which include scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers. And scavengers are animals such as jackals and vultures. In this picture here, the scavengers have the brown dot. So for example, the lion, the vulture, the hyena, and they clean up and eat the carcasses of large dead animals. Detritivores include things such as ants and beetles, and they consume litter or plant leaves and dead plant parts, debris, and dung or feces from animals. And the detritivores are the orange dots here, so that would include the dung-rolling beetle, who is consuming some dung or feces from another animal, in this case from the hare. And then we have decomposers, which are in our food web here in purple, and they are organisms such as fungi and bacteria that complete the final breakdown and recycling of organic materials and help make a lot of nutrients that would otherwise be held up just sitting on the ground as litter and debris. They help make those nutrients available, and those nutrients can go into the soil and then be taken up by plants and other animals. And in our picture, those include these bacteria and fungi and earthworms. The figure here looks at the amount of energy that's available to each of the different trophic levels or levels within the food chain in an ecosystem. So if you think of the plants or producers having 100% of the energy available from the sun, the plants then take in that energy, undergo photosynthesis, create sugar, and 16% of the energy that they took in is created into sugars, which are then available for herbivores. And the herbivores then use that sugar to live and are eaten by other animals, and only 1.8% of the original energy is available to the next level up in the food chain. And as those animals live and go about their lives, they are eaten by then the top carnivores, and only 0.1% of that original energy is available to the top carnivores. And for this reason, in an ecosystem, we tend to see the most amount of plants because there's the most amount of energy available for those plants. We see a fewer but still fairly large number of herbivores. We see, in our example earlier, this would be like the jackrabbits. We see a smaller number of primary carnivores. So for example, the bobcat in our scenario earlier, and then an even smaller number of top carnivores, such as the wolf in our example. And this is just because of the energy that's transferred from one link in the food chain to the next link in the food chain. We just covered how energy moves in cycles throughout an ecosystem, and next we're going to cover how other elements and compounds that are necessary for living things cycle throughout the ecosystem as well. This movement of elements and compounds is referred to as biogeochemical cycling, and this covers things such as the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, sulfur cycle, and we'll cover all of those here briefly in just a little bit. And John Muir, who was a naturalist, once said, "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world." And you'll see as we go through all of these cycles how everything is attached in these cycles in some way or another. Here we have the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle, which is probably the most familiar cycle to most people. And this is just the cycle that shows how water moves through an ecosystem. And water comes down to the earth mostly through precipitation or rain, and the rainfall moves through streams to the ocean. Most of the water on earth is stored in the ocean. Water then, so those are ways that water can move down and across the land. Water can also be evaporated from the ocean, evaporated from streams and rivers. And then transpiration is just organisms, plants and animals, giving off water as animals breathe or as plants go through respiration and photosynthesis. So plants and animals give off water, and lakes and streams and oceans give off water. Then the water moves also through plants and animals. As plants and animals eat each other, water moves through the ground and moves to different places. And so once again, this is the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. Let's look at a few reasons here now why water is such an important molecule on Earth. It really allows us to live life as we know it in many ways. And so first of all, water is the most abundant molecule in the cells of living things. It's necessary for a lot of the chemical reactions within living things. when we looked at photosynthesis and respiration, you notice water was in each of those chemical reactions, and water is in a lot of the chemical reactions that occur within your body and within living systems. Number 2, water is also an excellent solvent, so it can dissolve and transport many other essential nutrients that are essential to plants and animals. As plants take up water, they can absorb the nutrients that are dissolved in the water. Water also stays a liquid over a wide temperature range, so aquatic habitats can exist in very hot and very cold environments. You can have a really wide range of temperatures where the water is still a liquid and hasn't frozen or boiled and turned into a gas. Number 4, water helps stabilize temperatures and keeps areas from getting too hot or too cold. If you think of going to the ocean, the temperatures near the ocean are often a lot more in a smaller range than they are if you go inland, because the water of the ocean helps keep that temperature near the coast at a fairly constant temperature. Number 5, water forms crystal-like structures when it freezes, causing it to expand and become less dense. This is the reason that ice floats on top of water. And so if you have a lake and you get really cold temperatures outside and the lake starts to freeze, all the pieces of the water that freeze will float to the top of the water and create a frozen surface over the lake. This creates a barrier on top of the water and allows the water underneath to stay much warmer than the surrounding areas, and allows that water underneath to stay a liquid that animals can live in throughout the winter, rather than freezing solid through. Number 6, water has hydrogen bonds that help the water molecules stick together. And this is important for many reasons, but one example is that as water moves up a plant, instead of water molecules just getting pulled up the plant individually, the water molecules stick to the molecules beneath them, and they also get pulled up through the plant, all the water molecules below, which in turn sucks up water from the soil and allows the plant to pull water from deep in the soil. So water has some really amazing properties and really help out a lot of the processes in an ecosystem. Next up, we have the carbon cycle, which starts when plants take in carbon dioxide and use it through photosynthesis to create sugar. So again, we have plants taking in carbon dioxide, as we covered earlier in photosynthesis, and making sugar. The sugar molecule gets absorbed into the bloodstream of animals when animals eat plants, and then this carbon and energy source is available for cellular respiration, or breaking down the sugar to create other molecules and energy for the organism. If the animals use the sugar from plants in respiration, then they can breathe out that carbon that was in the sugar in CO2, and it takes about an hour or less for this to happen. And a plant could take up that same CO2 that you breathe out the same afternoon. So within just a few hours, you could get the sugar from a plant and eat it and breathe out that carbon dioxide from the sugar, and plants could take up the carbon dioxide. So it's this part of the carbon cycle is relatively. Carbon atoms from the sugar could remain part of your body or part of an animal's body until it decays after death. And so it could sit in your body or in any organism's body for a long time. Similarly, the carbon that's in wood of a 1,000-year-old tree is not going to be released until the fungi and bacteria break down the wood and then release the carbon dioxide when they go through respiration or breaking down that sugar or the carbon that's in that old tree. So recycling in the carbon cycle can also take a very long time, and fossil fuels can even take much longer, like coal and oil, or the remains of organisms that lived millions of years ago, and their carbon atoms aren't released until the coal and oil are burned. So in contrast to the photosynthesis and respiration, which recycle the carbon within hours, other processes like fossil fuels being created and that energy being released can take millions of years. Here we have an overview of the carbon cycle, just describing what we just talked about. So initially carbon entering into the cycle through photosynthesis. So we have our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that carbon dioxide goes into plants. So plants take in the carbon dioxide, convert it into sugars, which are then taken up by animals. And I wish they showed the animals on this diagram, but they were here, they'd be about here. And then the animals, through respiration, break down the sugar that was created by the plants, which has carbon in it, and turn that sugar into carbon dioxide, which then they breathe out through respiration. And that carbon dioxide goes back up into the air, where it can again be taken back in by plants. Here we have our fossil fuels, which are holding a large amount of carbon in them from dead plants and animals. And sediment also can have carbon in it. There's dissolved carbon dioxide in water, such as in the ocean, and carbon also located in rocks. Another way that carbon dioxide can get into the atmosphere, other than through respiration, is through the burning of fossil fuels. So as we burn fossil fuels, carbon dioxide also gets released into the atmosphere. Next up, we have the nitrogen cycle, which shows through how the element nitrogen is cycled through an ecosystem. And nitrogen originally gets into the living organisms through bacteria, which are able to take in nitrogen from the environment. And then there are special bacteria that live around the roots of certain plants called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And these bacteria convert the nitrogen into a form of nitrogen called nitrates that plants can absorb. The plants then absorb these nitrates and use them to build amino acids. Continuing on in the nitrogen cycle, plant proteins are consumed by animals, and then those proteins are incorporated into the animal's own protein molecules. So animals consume proteins from plants and then also make their own proteins. Nitrogen can re-enter into the environment through organisms when they die, and then fungi and bacteria decompose dead organisms and release that nitrogen back into the environment. And there's also a type of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria, which break down the nitrates into nitrogen gas and nitrous oxide gas, and that returns back into the atmosphere. Here we have an overview of the nitrogen cycle, and as we talked about, the first step in this cycle is nitrogen fixation, when bacteria take in nitrogen from the environment and make it into a form that is available through all these processes to be absorbed by plants. And plants absorbing this nitrogen is a process they call assimilation, and plants take up that nitrogen, use it to make proteins, and then animals eat the plants, take in that protein and all that nitrogen from the plants, and use that nitrogen and proteins to make their own proteins. And then they, through their waste, and decomposing bodies, that nitrogen is then sent into the ground, and decomposers can break down that nitrogen and again release the nitrogen into the ground, where eventually it can be transformed by bacteria and made available for plant uptake. Then, as we talked about, nitrogen is also given off into the atmosphere through bacteria and also through fossil fuel burning, and nitrogen then is released as a gas into the atmosphere. The next cycle that we have is the phosphorus cycle, and this cycle, in comparison to some of the other cycles, which can happen fairly quickly, takes millions of years. And minerals become available to organisms after they are released from rocks or salts. And producers take in inorganic phosphorus, so non-living sources of phosphorus, like a mineral from the rocks, and they incorporate it into organic molecules or living molecules. And then that phosphorus that's incorporated into the plant gets passed on to consumers, so much like a lot of the other nutrients. In this way, phosphorus cycles through the ecosystems, and then excess phosphates can occur in bodies of water and stimulate explosive growth of algae, upsetting ecosystem stability. So phosphates, if you do get too many in an ecosystem, certain things like algae can grow really rapidly and create, I'm sure you've seen ponds that have just excessive amounts of algae, and this is likely due to the large amounts of phosphates that might be in that water. And this can be due to a natural source or due to a human source where we've released phosphorus somehow into a body of water. An overview here of the phosphorus cycle, looking at it in the picture here, we have phosphates in the soil that are taken up by plants. Animals then eat the plants who get the phosphorus they need, and then animals, through their waste and through their decomposing bodies, the phosphorus is broken up by decomposers such as small organisms and bacteria and released back into the soil. The original source of that phosphorus is from weathering of rocks, and as I mentioned, that can take millions of years for that process to occur and that phosphorus to become available to the plants and animals again. Lastly, here we have the sulfur cycle, and most of the Earth's sulfur is tied up in underground rocks and minerals. So through weathering and as deep sea vents give off gases, like we talked about earlier, those hydrothermal vents, those deep sea vents, that sulfur can be released into the air and the water. And living organisms, mostly bacteria, can also hold on to some sulfur and release it into the environment. Another movement of sulfur through the ecosystem is when humans burn fossil fuels. This can release sulfur up into the air, and then that sulfur gets rained down in acid rain. Sulfur also plays a role in global climate, and there are these things called phytoplankton in the ocean, which are just very small little plants that live in the ocean, and these phytoplankton release sulfur into the atmosphere, which then reflects sunlight and helps cool the earth. And this may be the feedback mechanism that keeps Earth's temperature within a suitable range for life. So we've all heard about sort of the opposite, the greenhouse gases, which reflect, which keep the sunlight coming down to the earth and keep it inside the Earth's atmosphere. Well, these sulfur compounds do the opposite. They help reflect sunlight and keep it out of our atmosphere so that our Earth stays at a cooler temperature and doesn't get too hot. So lastly, here we have a picture of the sulfur cycle, and we have the sulfur up in the atmosphere, which came from the burning of fossil fuels, and that sulfur in the atmosphere can get rained down as acid rain. Sulfur through weathering and erosion can come out of rocks and go into rivers and into the ocean, and those ocean organisms, as I mentioned, can give off sulfur into the atmosphere and help to reflect the sunlight, keeping the earth at a nice cool temperature. In conclusion, the movement of matter and energy through various systems maintain all of the world's living environments. And we talked about the very basics of matter and what atoms are and how they move through the ecosystem through various cycles such as the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the phosphorus cycle. And then we also talked about what energy is and how energy moves through various organisms and how it's captured from the sun by plants and then moved to other organisms through the food chain.